Hey, what's up? Welcome to what is probably going to be a pretty lengthy video walking through all of the button customizations that I've done on my Sony FX3. If you know anything about me, if you follow this channel at all, you know that one of the things I do is aggressively customize all of my cameras. As much as I can, I map all the buttons to exactly what I want those buttons to do, so that as much as I can stay out of the menus and I can stay just focused on the actual composition and framing and all that when I'm actually shooting. And so today, what I wanted to walk you through is how I've customized all of the buttons on the Sony FX3. So before we start actually mapping out all the buttons, there are a few custom settings you have to do inside the camera that will make all these custom buttons make more sense. So starting off with the first one, the first thing I do on this camera is I set it up to shoot in Cine EI Mode. Now this isn't a whole deep dive on Cine EI Mode and what that is, but effectively Cine EI Mode does two things. First off, it makes the camera always shoot in S-Log3, which is the nice flat log profile to maximize dynamic range and all of that. And then secondly, it locks your ISO to one of the two cleanest ISOs or base ISOs on the FX3, which is the low base ISO of 800 or the high base ISO of 12,800. This just means that you're going to always have the cleanest possible footage with the most dynamic range. You don't have the ability to change that and to kind of accidentally bump your ISO in between that. And so I always set up my camera to shoot in Cine EI Mode. If you want to set this up on your camera, you just have to go into the shooting menu, over to image quality record, down to log shooting settings. Under log shooting, you choose Cine EI, and then color gamut, I choose sgamut3.cine and S-Log3, and you're good to go. The next thing I do on the FX3 to prepare it for all of these custom button mappings is I set my file format and my codec that I'm recording in to the what I think is the most versatile of the Sony FX3 codecs, which is the XAVC HS4K codec. Now there's a bunch of different file formats you can use on the Sony FX3. The HS codec is a more compressed, it's a newer codec. It only works on newer computers. You're going to get a little warning when you click on it, but as a reference, my computer is 4 or 5 years old and runs this completely fine. Really, as long as you have a computer that's made in the last like 5 or 6 years, you should be totally fine. And it's a really good balance between the actual size of your files and the quality. And one of my primary reasons to use this codec is because it actually unlocks some higher frame rates on the FX3 without having to upgrade your memory card from the V90 SD cards to the Compact Flash Express A cards, which are incredibly expensive. Shooting on the XAVC HS4K actually allows you to shoot in full 120, and you can do that on the SD cards, which is really, really convenient and I think a great reason to use this codec. Again, just go to the shooting menu to image quality record. The very top item on that menu is the file format. Set that to XAVC HS4K, and you should be good to go. All right, moving on. The third thing I set up on this camera is I set up my shutter mode to be the shutter angle versus the shutter speed. Now, shutter angle is a really complicated topic and really hard to explain without a bunch of graphics, but think of it as the ratio of your camera's shutter speed, say like 125th of a second or 1/60th of a second, etc., to the actual frame rate that you're shooting in, like 24 frames per second, 60 frames per second, etc. Now, you might have heard of the 180-degree shutter rule, which states that your camera's shutter speed should be 2 times the actual frame rate that you're shooting in. And so I set the shutter mode to be shutter angle, and then I set my shutter angle to 180 degrees. This unlocks the ability to switch between camera frame rates really, really quickly without having to adjust your shutter speed, because the camera knows at a 180-degree shutter, if I'm shooting in, say, 24 frames per second, it's going to set the shutter speed automatically to 1/48th of a second. If I bump that up to, say, 30 frames per second shooting, it's going to bump that up to 1/60th of a second, etc., etc., etc. So to set your shutter mode to shutter angle, you just navigate down to the exposure and color menu, and then under the first menu here, exposure, just go over to shutter mode and make sure that's set on shutter angle, and you should be good to go. Now, one thing to note, shutter angle is only available on firmware 6.0 and later on the FX3. So if you have one of the earlier firmware versions, you will have to upgrade that to get your shutter angle option, but that is an option on firmware 6.0 and above. All right, moving on. 2 more things that I customize on this camera. And the first one is I always make sure I have selected which monitoring LUT that I'm going to be using. So because the camera is set into Cine EI mode, and so it's always shooting in S-Log3, I don't really want to be monitoring on my camera in S-Log3 because S-Log3 is really grayscale, there's not a lot of contrast, there's not good color representation, it's really hard to get colors and exposure correct just by monitoring in S-Log3. And so I always want to have a monitoring LUT, and preferably the LUT that I'm actually going to use to convert that footage into a normal Rec 709 workflow. So where you go to select your user LUT is back to the exposure menu. Then you go down to submenu number 5, which is color and tone, and then over to select LUT. If you scroll through the menu here, you'll see that you can monitor in S-Log3, which just shows the native S-Log3 profile, which is obviously super gray and boring. You can monitor in Rec 709, which is just using Sony's embedded LUT to convert it to Rec 709, or you can import one of your own user LUTs, which is what I do, to do the conversion for you. So personally, I use Gamut's base LUTs, which are just incredible. I've used these for a number of years. There's a link down in the description if you want to check those out. And I just have installed that onto my different user profiles. And so I'm just going to select user 1, which is the Gamut base LUT for Sony S-Log3, and we're good to go. And then the last thing I do to set up this camera is I set up my S&Q mode to be shooting in 120 frames per second. So every once in a while, I'll shoot in a situation where I really want to have 120 frames per second recording. Now this camera with the XAVC HS4K format, you can actually shoot in 120 frames per second just natively in the camera with audio and all that. But when you use S&Q mode, the camera actually will slow that down and do all that editing for you just in camera. And so when you get the footage into post, it's already slowed down to the 5x slow motion, which for me just saves me an extra step and makes things significantly easier. And so what I do is I go into my shooting menu over to image quality record, down to S&Q settings, my record frame rate, which is the frame rate that is going to spit out. I want to have that be at 2398 because that's the typical timeline that I edit in, but I want the frame rate that I'm actually filming at to be 120 frames per second. So I set the first frame rate to 2398, and then the second one to 120 frames per second. And then my my quality record setting at the bottom, I just always max that out, 422 10-bit, and you should be good to go. All right, so that's a bunch of setup in the camera before we've even gotten to the buttons. Now let's dive into the actual button customization. So the first button that I've customized on this camera is my shutter button, and I want my shutter button to be able to start and stop recording. I know the FX3 literally has a dedicated record button right on the top of the camera, but just with the way that I hold the camera, the way that I operate it, it's just super natural for me to hold it with my finger on the shutter button, and just being able to press that to start recording is really, really helpful. So the way you set this up is just go down to the setup menu, which is all the way down at the bottom, down to operation customize, and then down at the bottom of that menu, it has the record with shutter option. You just turn that on, and that way when you press the shutter button, when you're in video mode, it will automatically start the video. So that's the first button. Now for the rest of the buttons, all of these are going to be found in the custom key dial settings submenu here at the top of the operation customize, and we are specifically going to be customizing the video buttons. All right, so we're just going to work our way down through this entire menu and customize every single button here, starting with on the back of the camera, and that's custom button number 5. And I have this button set up to change my recording frame rate. So if I'm on a normal shooting mode and I press that button number 5, it'll bring up the different options I have to change my recording frame rate. Now, something to note here is that these recording frame rates are very dependent on the codec that you are filming in. So for instance, right now I'm filming in the XAVC HS4K codec, and so it gives me the option to record in 2398, 5994, and 11988. If I were to switch this over to, say for instance, DCI 4K, then I would also have the option to shoot in pure 24 frames per second. If I was to open this up to the SI mode, it would get rid of the 120 frames per second, but it would add a 30 frames per second option. And so there's a bunch of different options depending on the codec that you're filming in. But for me, I use this primarily to switch between 23 and 60. And the convenient thing is because we've already set that shutter angle to 180 degrees, that means that when I'm shooting in 2398, the camera's automatically going to set my shutter speed to 1/48 of a second. And then if I just press the button, switch up to 60 frames per second, now the camera's shutter speed automatically changes to 1/120th of a second without me actually having to do anything. So I can very, very easily switch between frame rates without having to actually change my shutter speed, which is really convenient. The next button we're going to customize is button number 4, which kind of sits next to the little trash icon at the bottom of the camera. And I have this button mapped to open up my record media settings menu. Now this button is kind of awkward to access. I don't press it very much, and that's why I have this specific function attached to it. But every once in a while, and really specifically at weddings, I want to check and make sure that, for instance, I have both cards set to be simultaneously recording. Again, not a button I use very much, but it's super helpful to have that there, and so that's what I've done. All right, button number 3 is the center button on the little kind of thumb wheel section of the camera, and I have this set to switch my base ISO. Now, if you remember back when we first set up this camera, we set the camera to shoot in Cine EI Mode, which locks the ISOs to the low base ISO of 800 or the high base ISO of 12,800. Setting this button to be the base ISO switch means that with just the click of a button, you can automatically cycle between 800 and 12,800 without having to scroll all the way through all the different ISOs to get there. The next couple of buttons are the left and the right button on the little thumb dial area, and I've left these just how they are default, to turn on and off the zebra display as well as the peak-in display. But then the bottom button on this little dial, I have actually customized to open up my marker display to toggle that on and off. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, I do some content creation for some different brands, and so sometimes I'm shooting horizontally but trying to frame specifically for a vertical, and so having that 9:16 vertical aspect ratio marker on the screen is really, really helpful. But then there's also times where I'm shooting and I don't want that on, and so being able to just quickly press that button and toggle that display on and off is really, really helpful for me. Now, if you want to customize what that marker display actually looks like and what those actual lines look like on screen, just go into your shooting menu and scroll almost all the way down, or actually all the way down to marker display. Make sure that's turned on, and then you can turn your aspect marker to 9:16, 4:5, 1:1, 4:3, a bunch of different options in case you want that. I usually just leave mine set to 9:16, and then I can toggle it on and off by pressing that down button. So that does it for the back of the camera. Now let's move up to the top, and the first button we're going to choose here is the little number 1 or iris button, and I have that set to switch between normal movie mode and S&Q mode. Now, if you remember back just a couple minutes ago where we set up S&Q mode to be filming in 120 frames per second, but exporting a file at 2398, that's what this does. And this allows me to switch between this S&Q mode and whatever other mode I'm filming in with just the push of a button. Now you might ask, hey Josh, why don't you just use the little number 5 button and change your recording frame rate to 120? And then you would have audio as well. You totally could do that, and it's absolutely a viable option if you want to do that. For me, usually when I'm filming in 120, I don't care about audio, and I also don't want to have to just stretch that out and slow that down myself. And so being able to just press one button, have it automatically switch over, and already do the slow motion for me is really, really helpful. The next button is the number 2 button, and I've left this just to open up the white balance menu. Usually I'm shooting it in Kelvin, but every once in a while I want to switch to a different preset, and so just being able to press the white balance button is really convenient. The number 3 button, which is the ISO button, labeled as the ISO button on the top of the camera, I actually have this set to turn on and off that display LUT or that monitoring LUT that we selected earlier. Now, there's usually not a time where I want to actually monitor the S-Log3 footage on the back of the camera. However, I use this camera frequently with an external monitor, and one of the things that Sony does is it actually exports the LUT. If you have a display LUT on the camera, it's going to export that LUT through the HDMI feed to the monitor that I'm using, and that kind of screws up some things with the monitor in terms of like exposure and false color and all that. Having that there is really, really helpful, especially if you shoot with an external monitor and you want to make sure you send a clean signal out, but then also might handhold the camera and want to be able to monitor with a LUT on the back of the camera. Moving down to button number 4, which is the little focus toggle at the top of the camera. And I just have this set to switch the focus area. So if I just press the button in, it switches the focus area. Another pro tip here, I've also gone into the autofocus menu and limited my focus area to just the wide and then the super small center spot. Usually wide is what I'm using for everything, just letting the camera focus on things or tap focusing and having it track. But then sometimes I want to switch over to a specific spot that I want to focus on and just kind of focus and hold. So being able to press that button and just have it switch over to a spot and then back to wide is really, really convenient. And then the last button is just the normal record button on the top of the camera. I leave that one to just also be an alternate record button, as well as the next button that we're going to hit, which is the little custom button 6 on the front of the camera. I also leave that one to start and stop the recording, which means I literally have 3 different recording buttons on this camera: the shutter button, the top record button, and the front button. I'll say this, I use all 3 of them, depending on how the camera is mounted, if it's kind of in an awkward position. If I'm standing in front of the camera, maybe I'll use the front one. So just having a lot of different options for me to start and stop recording is really helpful. So all 3 of those buttons are mapped to start and stop recording. The next button you get to customize is actually the button that comes on your lens. And so if you see the lens right here, there's a little like button here, and you can customize what this button does. But what I do with this is I set this to be a focus hold. So basically if the camera's in autofocus and you're focusing on something, and then say something's going to move in front of it, or you just want to stop focus and you want to kind of move without focus changing, or I use this a lot if I want to focus on something and then kind of pull back and like blur that thing out, because I'm going to use it for a background or an end transition or something like that. What you can do is just, as you're letting the camera autofocus, then just focus on what you want, then press the button on the lens, the focus will hold, and then you can start moving, and that focus is going to stay on the same distance that it was already set at, meaning you can blur out the background or you can let people walk in front of it without losing focus. It's really, really handy. I don't use it all the time, but in situations where you need it, it comes in really, really handy. So having the lens button set to be a focus hold button is really helpful. And that just leaves us with the dials on the camera, and all of these are tiles I've customized. I've done quite a lot to these. So before we actually talk about these dials, I want to remind you of how we set up this camera. So we are shooting in Cine EI mode, which means the ISO is locked to either 800 or 12,800, and we're going to be changing that just by pushing a button on the back of the camera. So we don't need to have an ISO dial because we're not going to be switching between ISOs other than just a toggle switch back and forth. Because we set up the camera to shoot with shutter angle instead of shutter speed, we also don't need to change the shutter speed at all. Shutter speed is going to be completely determined by whatever frame rate the camera is shooting in, and we have custom buttons for that anyway, so we also don't need a shutter dial. So all we need out of these dials is the aperture, and maybe it's because I came from Canon, or maybe this is just what feels natural to me, but I have the little scroll wheel on the back set to control my aperture. That leaves the front wheel and the back wheel to kind of do whatever I want with, and the way that I've done this is I've set up the back wheel to control my Kelvin white balance. Like I said earlier, I'm usually shooting in a custom Kelvin white balance, and so being able to just kind of quickly scroll up and down through the Kelvin number range to cool off or warm up a shot is really, really helpful. Now the front thumb dial I'm constantly experimenting with. Currently I have this set up to change my audio recording level. So if I just have a simple like shotgun mic on the camera, or if I just kind of have an ambient mic and things get super loud, I can just kind of scroll that down to lower the gain level coming into the camera. Not really something I use all that much. And so if you have suggestions on that, feel free to let me know what you do with that front dial or what you would do with that front dial if you were me. But that's currently what I have it set up to do, but I'm definitely open to suggestions on that one. So anyway, that is my FX3. That's how I've customized this. Hopefully that's been inspirational for you. If it has, let me know down in the comments, or if there's something that you would change, you would do differently, that you do differently on your specific camera, or something that I should know about how this camera works, please let me know down in the comments as well. And I will see you in the next video. Cheers.